of Pinellas County. I bring you greetings on behalf of Sean King, the chair of the COC board, and as well as Amy Foster, the director of the Homeless Leadership Alliance, as well as the members of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Everyone in the committee has been working hard to bring you this event today, as well as the staff of the Homeless Leadership Alliance, and we're so happy that you're here with us today. Your commitment here today, your presence here today is commitment to your is evidence of your commitment to equity. So we hope that you learn more by sharing with us today and hearing more about the toolkit, and find even more ways that you can help make a difference. We're excited about the agenda that we have prepared for you today. We're going to have Dr. Susie Patterson. As you remember from last year's event, she shared with us the qualitative research that she did, and she's going to highlight the data and the way the data has changed or improved or has not improved since last year's event. We're going to have Esther Matthews share with us updates on our committee's work, our DEI committee's work, as well as our CEO Race Equity Next Steps and the HLA Strategic Plan. We'll also have TV Lee and Sidonia Boone from the HLA, who's going to share with you specifics about the COC Race Equity Toolkit. And then you've all chosen to participate in specific breakout sessions. And so we're going to go into our breakout sessions at that point, where you'll hear presentations from those that are involved in housing, around housing and equity around the community, and they'll speak to you and share on housing, fair housing and project policies, evaluating equity, community commitment, and equitable workforce. And after those breakouts, during those breakout sessions, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions from the experts and hear more about how you can improve the work in your organizations toward equity. Following those breakout sessions, you'll return back to the group. Our group facilitators that are in those sessions with us will provide feedback and report out on what was discussed. And then we'll round out today's event with a call to action. So the next up, I will invite Susie Patterson, Dr. Susie Patterson, to share and provide a data update on where we are now compared to last year.
Hi, everyone. Of course, my dog started barking as soon as it's my turn to start going. But I'm going to highlight some of the trends that we saw in 2020 versus how they've changed to 2021. So we can go to the next slide. So in 2020, we took a look at racial demographic data and highlighted the two largest populations by race in this county. If you take a look at the whole population versus who is in poverty versus who is experiencing homelessness, we see a clear trend here that white people make up the largest majority of Pinellas County, but we can see that the number in poverty is less than the overall population, and those experiencing homelessness are still less than that. We see the opposite happening when it comes to Black residents of Pinellas County. Black residents only make up 10% of the county. Those experiencing poverty, or those in poverty, are twice that amount, and those experiencing homelessness increase even more so. We can go to the next slide. This is even more, we can see this even more when we look at family data. So white families make up 74% of the county versus Black families making up 16% of the county. Those in poverty, white people, are 59%, and those experiencing homelessness out of that population are 33%. We see the opposite trend happening again when it comes to Black families. 58% of Black families that in this county experiencing homelessness, or 58% of that number experiencing of those in homelessness, are Black. You can go to the next slide. So if we take a look at FY21 data, Of those entering the homelessness system of care as newly homeless in the fiscal year 2021, 25.7% were households with minor children, compared to fiscal year 20, when it was 21.1%. In fiscal year 2021, there's 61% of the households with minor children that entered the system as street homeless and exited to permanent housing were Black, compared to, I think this is supposed to be 42% in fiscal year 2020. But we still see the same trends happening. And we also see that those experiencing homelessness as a proportion of the population experiencing homelessness has actually gone up 7% with Black residents in this county. So as COVID has happened, as we see different events happening, we have a housing crisis in this community, we see that it is disproportionately affecting Black residents of this county. And that's a trend that we really need to pay attention to. So I think that might have been the last slide.
Thank you, Susie. We appreciate you sharing data with us. And now we're going to invite Esther Matthews to share with us updates on committee work.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Reed, and thank you to HLA for the desire to put this committee actually not just in conversations, but actually in actions. Many of you may know that HUD asked COCs in 2019 to begin to look at their race disparities. The Data and System Performance Committee created a subcommittee to review that data once it was all compiled. HLA with a USF intern looked and took the 5-year PIT data and compared it with findings across the country. From that review, the recommendations was made to the COC board to create an official diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, of which I am a member and very proud to be there. When we look at the work plan overview of the committee, and I'm just going to do just a very quick high level overview, and then we'll go to the PowerPoint, Avery. A lot of work has been taking place. We've identified and developed workshops on how organizations can begin to address issues, looked at training the trainer opportunities, develop monitoring tools for actual organizational COC implementation. In the trainer, we've looked at the accountability of those trainers, the standards that are incorporated as it reflects on the overall COC evaluations, with monitoring included. Also looked at training in the Courageous Conversations, which, if you have not had an opportunity to be a part of those conversations, I truly encourage you to move forward with that. Many and much work has begun to take place and has been taking place over the years. Before we move to our PowerPoint, I want to encourage you, if you are not a part of the DEI committee, please jump in and work with us as we move towards true diversity, inclusivity within our community. Now, our PowerPoint. So the community work plan, we have 4 focal points: evaluation, research, implementation, and advising. As you look at the PowerPoint, and I'm not a verbatim reader, so I won't do that to you, but you'll see the key components for each section. Training and COC system evaluation is going to fall under the evaluation. Best practice and data quality falls under research. Our stakeholders, how they feel, what they want to see, falls under advising. And then the implementation, of course, is the implementation of all of that: programming, policies, procedures, and data quality. Next slide, Avery. Right, so let's look at the year in review. Again, as I said a moment ago, much work has taken place. You'll see that we looked at the COC bullying policy, coordinated entry, looked at the 21-day challenge for HLA, really dug in deep, and this was a fantastic meeting that we had when we looked at individuals with lived experience. I think I walked away from that with a completely lens off, clear clarity view of our community. When you really speak to those who are in the situation and dealing with it. We looked at and revised the LGBTQIA plus shared glossary. We also reviewed and looked at and updated the race equity toolkit. Florida Housing Coalition training, annual fair housing LGBTQIA plus training, bias training. One of the key trainings that was in place. Shared language glossary. This was an important one. Really ensuring that we are truly speaking the shared language across the board. Quarterly data reviews, joint meetings with the data system team and funders council, and then the new coordinated entry assessment. Next slide. So the Pinellas Continuum of Care Race Equity Toolkit. We spent a lot of time on this one. Next slide, Avery.
Next slide goes over to the HLA staff, Esther.
All righty, and so I will pause there and throw the baton over to the HLA team. Thank you.
Sidonia?
Good morning. I apologize. I was having some problems getting in this morning, but good morning. So we were going to talk a little bit about the tools, the 4 principles for the racial equity: education on racial equity, identification of racial equity issues in organizations, creation of a plan for change, and the implementation of the tools. This kit we've worked on quite a bit to try to get it up and ready to go. So we were talking about education, the history of fair housing. I think, wasn't someone else supposed to talk about that one, Avery?
No, it's okay, Sidonia, I can cover. What we wanted you all to know is what was in the toolkit specifically. So what we've done is we've given you a very high level of what's in the table of contents. So this is the introduction to it as to why we need this type of toolkit. Number one reason is that it's really important to understand race equity. This is an educational toolkit for providers, for stakeholders, for our partners. You know, what you'll know is that about 3/4 of the toolkit is just content for you and your staff, your board, your supporters, just to absorb and understand what do we mean when we talk about race equity and how it impacts the continuum of care. And without a clear understanding of such things like as the history of fair housing, we can't identify how we can change it now. And also then without acknowledging the power of language and creating a safe space for conversations on race, we're not able to open our minds and hear new ideas and new perspectives. And without a plan, we won't know how to implement any changes internally. And that's what we bring to you within the toolkit. This is something to help those that are housing and homeless providers work through grant applications. Lots and lots and lots of questions are being asked now on requests for information and requests for proposals on what is your organization doing to provide equity, diversity, and inclusion within your own organization. So many organizations have good intentions. They want to bring positive changes, but they don't know how to start. They don't know how to answer those questions on the RFIs and the RFPs. This toolkit is a guide for you. And through the use of an organizational plan, the equity impact tool, and the race equity impact tool worksheet, organizations can begin to analyze the functioning of how their agency and how that agency can better promote race equity. And with that, I turn it over to TV.
Thank you, Avery. And listening to you speak on that slide, I know I did some work on that too, but it just put another idea in my head about how the toolkit, we want to look at it as obviously a tool, as Sidonia mentioned before, but as I was reviewing the slides and the toolkit and everything to present today, I was thinking, like we discussed before, it's largely an educational tool where we need to use it to help our understanding of everything and how we're going to approach different issues in our own agencies. And then just now I was thinking of real tools because I did some DIY work over the weekend where you're using like drills and stuff. And usually when people get things like this, you don't want to read the instruction book. You just want to get in there, you know how to put the little head in there, and then you just turn it on and it puts the screw on, or you reverse it and it takes it off, whatever you want to do. So really you're thinking you know how to use it and it's working well. But if you read the instruction book, you would probably learn a lot more. And I was thinking the same thing about our toolkit, because there's so much that you need to read and understand first. And I know people are going to want to jump to, you know, what are we doing with it? How do we use it? Which is what I'll go over right now. But it's really important to make sure that we're really addressing the whole beginning, the introduction, all the information that we need to be taking in. So I just thought that was an interesting thing that came into my head while you were speaking. But yes, so what can you actually do with it? So once you've actually taken some time to review everything that we've put into the toolkit to help you understand the best approach, you should be using these tools to assist in developing your own strategy for moving forward with racial equity work and addressing the logistical issues of how to approach it in your own agency. As mentioned in the previous slide, the toolkit is largely educational, and that shouldn't be taken lightly. Another idea that came before when we did all this planning was in our own agency at the HLA, they hosted a 21-day challenge. And if nobody is familiar with that, it's the challenge that was created by Dr. Eddie Moore Jr. And it's a racial equity habit building challenge that encourages you to spend intentional time each day for 21 straight days, focusing on racial equity. So that can be anything from reading, learning, engaging, connecting, reflecting, or just staying inspired by talking to other coworkers in your agency. And when we held that, I was only able to join for maybe 1/5 of the conversations. Honestly, we got slammed, but some of the conversations were very specific and narrow to a certain topic, so it stayed in one direction, but some were very broad, and it just allowed for coworkers to share moments and experiences and thoughts on different topics. It could go left to right to whatever, all over the place, just so you could share. And I think that this allowed for each of us to spend intentional time each day focusing on that subject. And then it builds the habit, because every day you're thinking, okay, tomorrow morning, we're going to be talking about something. Let's keep our minds in that same zone. So we start our next day with having those conversations. And I thought that was great. And even when I wasn't joining, I was thinking about it. I would think, I wonder what they're talking about today. And sometimes I would see in the chats like, oh, that sounds so interesting. I wish I was there. So if I were to be the one using this tool, the racial toolkit that we're presenting today, the goal would be to approach our agency services with that racial equity lens. So I would initiate my own 21-day challenge where for at least 30 minutes a day or whatever you can spare with your coworkers, you just tackle a new portion of the racial equity toolkit. So if anyone has, I don't know if anyone's seen it yet, but it's, I think, over 50 pages long. And the tool part is just at the very end, you know, it's just a few pages, but what's important is all of those beginning pages that you might not want to read. So I think if you break it up into sections and you use the toolkit informational parts as a means to guide those discussions over 21 days or how many ever days you can dedicate, it would not only allow for a deeper shared understanding of the document, but provides an opportunity for everyone to get together and maybe bring up questions about the toolkit that you can ask each other or come back to DEI and ask us. So I just think there's not enough emphasis on safe space conversations amongst colleagues and all of that. So I think that would be a good way to facilitate those conversations as well, just using the toolkit. And then of course, making a plan. So what's your ultimate goal and what tools in this toolkit can you use to achieve those goals? How can you implement changes within your organization? And what's your timeline? What are your milestones? And everyone talks about SMART goals, but really it is smart to use SMART goals. How much of your budget can you apply to this project if it requires any money at all, not just talking to each other? And what can the COC do to further help? I think someone mentioned that the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee was going to host quarterly helping sessions for anyone interested in getting hands-on help using this toolkit. So that's a great resource as well. Thank you.
Thank you, TB, and thank you, Esther, for sharing with us, and also Sidonia. I appreciate it. I think one of the things that we really wanted to do with this toolkit was provide instructions on how to have those conversations, because I think what's missing in our society today is opportunities to have conversations about race. People enter discussions assuming they know, assuming they understand others' perspectives on race. And I think that's a huge fallacy, because then we get into all of the trouble and all the issues of dissension and tension between each other, because we don't have those opportunities to communicate. So, I invite you all, as you start this approach in your organizations, to walk in with an open mind, to be aware that there are things you don't know, and there are things that others in your organizations can enlighten you on, so that you can improve as an organization. And, with the end result in mind being that we're trying to improve outcomes for the residents of Pinellas County, whether it's in housing, whether it's poverty, whatever the issues are that we're facing as a county, we're trying to improve those issues and to bring equity to the forefront. One other thing I wanted to mention that Esther mentioned was our discussions on lived experience. So we brought persons with lived experience to our committees, but we're not where we want to be when it comes to lived experience. We want members to be a part of all of our committees, and that's something that the COC has is considering and wants to make sure that they're bringing lived experience to all of our committees. So we are inviting members. If you know of persons with lived experience, whether they're persons of color, persons who are homeless, persons who are formerly homeless, we want them to be a part of everything that we do, because we don't want to move and decide that we have the answers for what they've experienced. We want to have the voices in the room, the voices being a part of all decisions that are being made. So if you have persons that you know that will be interested in serving on the DEI committee, please share them with Avery. Don't put their names in the chat, but reach out to Avery personally, so that she can then perhaps navigate how to reach out to those persons and invite them to be a part of the committee. So I wanted to make sure I highlight those two things. So now we're going to go into our breakouts. So I'm going to send this back to Avery to talk about how the breakout time will go and where we'll go from there. Avery.
Hi, everybody. So we have a really exciting event planned for you all. We hear you loud and clear that you all need some excitement when we do presentations. We just don't want to be talked to. So this is an opportunity for you to learn from local experts. Each of you, when you registered, selected what kind of breakout panel you wanted to attend to get a little bit more in depth about certain areas within the toolkit. We tried to make everybody's first pick work. You are all been pre-slotted. So in a few minutes, Brianna is going to close this main room and break you all out into your small groups. You have 2 local panelists per small group that are going to give a presentation on their expertise. And then from there, once they're finished wrapping, it's your turn. Share your experiences, ask questions, make comments, connect with one another. And then at the end of the 45 minutes, an hour, We're going to bring you all back and do key lessons learned. Each room, except for one, has a moderator. That moderator is going to be TV Sidonia and myself, and we will introduce our speakers to you, and then we'll be the ones watching that for the chat for questions. Any comments, feel free to enter them into the chat. Feel free to raise your hands. That's your turn. That's your time to speak and share with all of us, because we want to learn more from you. So with that, I'm going to ask you all for a little bit of patience while Brianna goes ahead and closes us out. There will be a timer so that will bring you right back into this room. But if you happen to finish early, you can exit your chat, your panel room, your breakout room, and come back into the main room at any time. Brianna's going to be there. So with that, I'll ask Brianna, go ahead and put us into our breakouts.
Patients, quickly, the breakout rooms, if you didn't sign in with the email that you provided, then it's going to take me just a second, but I'm going to go ahead and open them, and then we'll get you all sorted into your rooms.
I got kicked back to the main session, Avery.
Yep, just give me a few seconds. I'm working on getting you all into your rooms.
Okay.
Okay, everyone should be in a breakout room now.
I've got Tim, Trudy, and Sidonia that still are not.
Yes, they're assigned to one, they just have to accept going into it.
Okay, so Sidonia, I need you to accept your room. And then Tim, when he comes back, can you put me in fair housing? Thank you so much, Brianna.
Yeah, of course. It didn't work whenever I,
It's okay. Amazing job.
thank you. Okay, okay.
Yeah, just throw me into fair housing.
Oh, there you go. It says that you're not joined, but you're going to fair housing.
There you go.
Okay, you should be there. I'll be here.
Everybody? Oh, thank you so much, everyone. So what I'm going to do right now is we're at the feedback session. So needless to say, we're ahead of time and you guys are all going to get out early. So yay us. But we want to hear from each of you within your breakout rooms to see what happened, what were the takeaways. And then I'm going to ask for Esther to kind of bring us back together and before Stephanie goes into our next steps. So I'll start. I was the moderator in the fair housing breakout where we had Mark and Danielle do an amazing panel discussion for us. And our takeaways from this were what's really important when working within fair housing is to ensure that as providers, as stakeholders, as funders, we are reviewing current policies and procedures to determine if there's any violation for fair housing requirements. That may be our own policies and procedures, as well as that of others. Annual training is vital. That's vital and critical for staff so that we are all up to date and we know what to be looking for when helping. It's also important for staff to do the policies. If we have fair housing policies that are a part of our organization, we need to actually be working through those policies and implementing them and then monitoring ourselves. We also learned from Danielle that oftentimes fair housing, it happens in our own backyard. One thing that she took us through was some reports from other housing authorities where there were violations and there was a very costly outcomes from that. And one was right in Tampa. And so learning that it's in our own backyard is very important to know that we talk loftily sometimes, but it does happen. One thing that came up for us was the concern of pseudo profiling, meaning it's coming out from law enforcement, possibly, or code enforcement, possibly under the guise of helping. And it's difficult enough to continuously building those helping relationships with two entities that our clients may be fearful of. What we want to make sure is that we don't discount the help that law enforcement and code enforcement really is providing to us and our clients, and that perhaps it's those policies that's causing that that pseudo profiling. It may not be the people themselves, it may not be their actions themselves, but their policies. We need to look into the fairness of the treatment of others to ensure that all processes are the same across the board. Disability can be a large hurdle to overcome, so HUD is aware of that and has made changes to what they look at for support animals. The change in the administration makes sure that housing authorities across the country are doing away with one-strike policies, and that when it comes to incidences, they're to be approached on an individual basis. Documentation can save or break us, so always document, document, document. We learned that from Danielle. That's how we can support our clients. Building relationships is key to finding landlords that help to remove barriers to restrict housing and neighborhood choice. Passive discrimination's out there, and we need to be aware of it. And a passive discrimination is, yes, absolutely, I can rent you this apartment for $5,000, but the roof is caving in. So those are things that we need to look for. And how can we overcome that is a great recommendation of working with apartment association meetings. At these meetings, you're able to speak to landlords and property management firms and provide them education about your programs, about your clients and how they can help. And I'll put that into the chat. We've also got the fact that there is greed out there and there is discrimination out there. And that when those two come together, people can't navigate anything. And that's a lot of times what we're trying to deal with. So understand that you're not alone. You need to use the system. And by that, we mean you need to know where to file your complaints, where to get help, knowing that enforcement's real. That enforcement can harm us if we're not following our own policies and procedures, and it can be very costly if we're not. But we need to know the system and use the system to help our clients. We need to be visible to promote housing equity. And education's empowering. So not only do we need to educate ourselves and our staff, but we need to educate our clients. They need to know their rights. Where do they report? How do we give them those tools to self-advocate? And so with that is a big takeaway for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee was a request for a quick resource. One sheet that says, here's where you need to go. You know, this is what you need to know, and here's where you need to go. HUD has some of those, so we're going to adopt some of them, but then we're going to do what we do best in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to look at it and then put our own spin and twist on it for Pinellas County. Advocacy. That's another action step that everybody needs to take, is advocating as a community. It needs to be a community organizing event, is to advocate. And to keep in mind that there is training available out there. Pinellas County government has fair housing training, and it is available to all. So that was our takeaways from fair housing. And I'm going to put that one thing into the chat, make sure I got it all for everybody. Okay, that is the Bay Area Apartment Association meeting organization. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I think, TVIC first, and hear her feedback and takeaways.
Thank you, Avery. And I think mine will be more tracking the conversation. So it's kind of just going to go chronologically through the topics that we discussed. It'll probably sound like a big blob, but the conversation was great. And thank you for providing some questions, because they were also very good in prompting some conversations that we had towards the end as well. But our topic in our room was evaluation, and the panelists were Dr. Reed and Dr. Patterson. So we kind of went into research and application, which is awesome. And we started with a brief explanation of evaluation, which critically examines a program. So obviously we're using that to make judgments and improve effectiveness, improving our program design, the impact, and implementation. And then we went into equitable evaluation. So we need to look at systemic racism and how they're affecting programs. Who's being funded and what are they being funded for? And of course, our evaluations need to be objective. So you're approaching each evaluation with the understanding that the evaluators are the experts and that they're being objective when they're approaching each organization.
Want to interrupt you, TV. I just because I want to say the goal is to not that there is no objectivity actually.
Oh,
That's not what, yeah, because that's like one of the orthodoxies of evaluation. But when we're doing equitable evaluation, that the evaluators are not the experts, they're helping to facilitate
right.
conversation and learning, and the experts are those with lived experience, people in the organization.
Thank you. Okay, and then evaluations need to be multiculturally valid. And if you're designing a survey, who's going to be able to answer and understand your survey? Is the tool that you're using accessible to different populations of people? And that made me think of when Avery mentioned that pseudo profiling. So the tool from law enforcement under the guise of helping, but clients are fearful to use it. I think it goes hand in hand with that comment as well. And everything is relevant in a grand social cultural context. There's a deep-rooted legacy and history that perpetuated the things that we see today. So what are the perspective of the designers, which is what Dr. Patterson was just saying. What lens do they operate through that define their designs, and what are their biases? And maybe their designs are not applicable to all groups, which is why we need to include people of different perspectives and backgrounds, including those with lived experience, which is extremely important. Also considering the geographic locations and political context of everyone involved. And most importantly, again, we have to acknowledge the perspective of all the participants. Dr. Reed mentioned briefly that she tracked data pre-pandemic to collect race, and there were a lot of people contracting COVID, but no race recorded for that data that was being collected. And then the people contracting COVID, I think, was larger than the population of the Black people and the white people in the population. And this didn't give her an opportunity to look at any inequities because the race data wasn't being collected at all. So they discussed
for those where the race was unknown, it was a larger population. So we were missing a whole bunch of people in understanding how race how COVID infections were affecting people of different racial and ethnic groups.
Thank you. And then some really good questions were brought up and issues as well. We had Kathleen, who is on the COC board, and she is on the Clearwater City Council. And she said that they recently got a team of stakeholders, I think, for building a grant. And she said that she was looking for the minority representation in that group. And there wasn't much, which is why she was trying to acknowledge that. And the group said they needed to be, I think she said, nimble and quick about forming this group and creating the grant and all of that. So they kind of just collected people they knew, and she didn't like that. So she was trying to look at a way to approach that issue and include more minorities in that group in order to build that equity in the grant building. She saw that they kept business receipts, and I don't know the ins and outs of city council and all of that, but she said that nothing in those receipts that they kept for their businesses tracked the race. So she was asking how she might be able to navigate that. And I think they started to add a section where businesses can voluntarily report their gender and race and all of that. So she was looking into what legal tools there might be to intentionally improve the number of maybe more females, more minorities in that data. And I think somebody answered and they mentioned that the funders drive the expectations. So if you're providing the funding, then you can kind of dictate what you want to see and acknowledge that you want to have everything through the equity lens, and then you get to decide where the funding goes. So that helps drive that point. We also looked at why people aren't looking at services. This was actually prompted from another research that I was a part of before, seeing like WIC participants and why they're not accessing services, and then putting that on our services to see why maybe some in the population are not successfully accessing our programs. And we kind of just went into the explanation that there's just all different reasons, and you might make assumptions, but you don't know. So we need to incorporate more program participants in order to get that information from them, which drives the point home that we really need to incorporate more people with lived experiences that can provide us with that feedback and information. And they emphasize the importance of being able to compensate them for that feedback in order to prioritize getting that information and their input, which is really important because it's our work, so we get paid to do it, but we can't just ask them for help and then not give anything back. And then Zoe asked a really good question, and she was trying to see if there were any suggestions for navigating conversations with stakeholders who see social justice as maybe separate from their goals, or they see data as objective when it's not. So is that what we were saying, Dr. Patterson? Does that sound correct, the way I phrased that?
Yeah, I think that's what Zoe's still here too. I don't know if she wants to clarify, but it sounds like a lot of what she was kind of asking about.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that objectivity piece was correct. But basically, you know, how do we acknowledge that with the stakeholders and bring change there? So that was a difficult question, I think, but they said something along the lines of how stakeholders might see that evaluations slow down work because it's extra work and it's just not aligning with their direct goals, or they could just be focused on making sure their organization looks good, so they don't want to dive into all that and then dig up any issues that might be there. So they really focused on acknowledging what the values are, what the mission is, and the toolkit that we are presenting requires a real commitment to making change and taking a lot of time to make that change. So it's kind of important to just take it back to the roots and say, you know, what's important to you and why do you want to incorporate that kind of change? And then from there, you can move forward and see how maybe you might be able to make a difference. And then we went into challenges in managing equity-focused evaluations, which kind of was about that as well. And just another emphasis on getting lived experience point of views to contribute to our system building and the day-to-day work. So making sure we're getting the input from those with lived experience. And finally, one of the last questions we asked was, why does equity matter in evaluation of projects or policies? And it was said that if you don't consider equity, we're only thinking through the lens of dominant culture, right? You don't see what everyone is seeing, you don't see it the way they see it. So you need to remember to see everything through a racial equity lens so you can acknowledge everyone's perspective. Because if not, then you're just reproducing that dominant perspective that's been there over time. So that's why you need to embed equity to see and think through different perspectives. And that was it.
Thank you so much, TV. So next we'll hear from Sidonia and what her breakout group came back with. Sidonia?
All right, our breakout group was with Delquanda Turner and Rodney. We had the equitable workforce. Delquanda spoke a lot about how diversity drives results, how you need to use data in order to understand how that does drive the results. You need to get information from the big four, which includes the people, the customers that you're working with. Your community needs to have some input as well as your partners, because different groups, different people, different customers have different ideas as to what diversity drives or what results works for them and what's needed. We also talked about organizations need to be raw, which basically means they need to be ready, able, and willing to do the work, not just say they're going to do it, put together a plan, and then don't follow up with it. We also talked about recruitment, How do you get people involved? How do you attract the people that you are wanting to provide the opportunities to? So we talked about participation. Go where the people are, have them join you and be a part of the conversation. Use language that they understand, and also meet in areas and groups to see how you can assist them and what input they have to also assist you with your ideas, challenges, and what it is that the effect that you're trying to have on the program. Measure your training and what the actual effect is. Don't just provide the training, invite people to come to the training, and then have no way of measuring what they got out of the training realistically, not just doing like a little survey, but to really understand what did they get out of the training. Have them practice what and participate after the training, not just during the training. How did their participation look once that training is completed? Make them accountable. How are they going to be committed? Are the leaders, or is your leadership also committed to the program? Those are the things that we talked about as to how to make the process work. We talked about how in order to make it work, you must be willing to make the change within ourselves. So we had a lot of good conversation about the different cultures. How do you change people's ideas when they're not willing to change them? Sometimes you have to let them go. Sometimes you continue the conversation. That basically comes down to that uncomfortable conversation, how you have to do that, how you have to have that sometimes, and be willing to hear both sides of that conversation and adjust to it. So that was a lot of what we talked about. Didn't have as much to add as, but we had a lot of good conversation, but those were the key elements that we talked about. And then we went into more details about our own feelings about different situations that we've had to deal with and how we feel about the situations as far as equity and diversity within ourselves.
Thank you, Sidonia. That's vital. I'm so happy your group was able to do that. Thank you. Last but not least, let's hear from Esther.
Awesome. Thank you again. And thank you to our committee or our panel of professionals, Carrie, Rodney, before he left to lead his own panel, April, Laquelle, Shauna, Trudy, Teresa, and Yvonne. Your voices were greatly appreciated. So we talked about a lot. We implemented some additional questions, but the gist and a summary of is that we need to ensure that we listen to understand. We need to be ready to move forward with true action. Understand that people are going to get it wrong, but allowing them grace. And then ensure that there's a representative at the table from all communities. That we spent some time with the conversation that oftentimes, when we think of diversity, we think Black and white, but the reality is that diverse means that there are individuals from all spectrums, not just color, not just a level of disability. There are many not just, but ensuring that the table is wide enough for everyone to bring a chair up. We talked about having an understanding that there needs to be authenticity in organizations and that it must be implemented. And again, thank you, Trudy, for the quote that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. We talked about honoring the golden rule. Thank you, Teresa. Talked about what is the story and how can we ensure that we serve successfully. Taking a vested interest in what's taking place in the community. And when you take that vested interest, that means that you are truly going to do the work. sitting down at the table with full community collaboration, sitting at the table with those who are not aligned with DEI to get their perspective. And then when we sit at that table, we listen to learn and understand their point of view. Breaking down silos, reaching across the table. And then when meeting the needs of the people, we need to ensure that we think holistically in the approach. We need to show up, right? A lot of times we come to the table with a preconceived concept, but sometimes we just simply need to show up and be present and listen. Being aware of our own bias, and then respecting the value and supporting lived experiences. And there's value when individuals are coming to the table with their lived experiences, but respecting them with that value, not just with asking them to volunteer their time, but offering and allowing for some level of compensation with the understanding that they are living their experience right now. And so I believe that I captured everything. Before I go to the next piece, I want to make sure, Carrie, did I miss anything? All right, fantastic. And so when we talk about equity, you know, it's truly an understanding of what an individual, group, or community needs, and then determining how to invest intentional resources to support those needs. Leading and working towards equity takes a nuanced and sophisticated approach that I feel HLA is leading. It requires both understanding a given community and strategically matching the services and support to the needs of that community. I'm excited that this group of thoughtful leaders have moved from talking to leading with equity. And I want to go back to that quote, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Now, before I turn it back over to Dr. Reed, I want to leave with a thought, which actually turned into a question in our panel. And the question was, how might we use this moment that HLA is leading to inspire, engage, and activate our communities to protect system approaches that ensure that every person has access to the resources, the opportunities that they need to live, develop, and thrive in Pinellas County. And with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Reed.
Thank you, Esther. And
Absolutely.
I especially want to thank every one of you that is here today, and our guest panelists for their experience, their expertise, their time, and their commitment to this so very important issue of equity in our community. And I want to challenge you today with our call to action for 2022. The Pinellas Continuum of Care is invested in ensuring that we support all national and local efforts to assess and strengthen homelessness response systems by leading with racial justice and equity practices in pursuit of housing justice. The call to action for today is to center racial equity and the voices, the brilliance, and the gifts of those with lived experience. We strive for significant changes in the homelessness response system and challenge each agency to adopt specific tactics at the personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural levels at which racism operates, including commit to learning, self-reflection, and institutional reflection. Improve the experience of all persons going through the homeless response system through organizational improvements. Commit to structural changes that will increase housing stability, especially for those disproportionately represented in the homeless response system. Respect the lived experience of persons of color and of those who have experienced homelessness. Commit to understanding how staff and clients experience our organizations and whether there are differences in benefit by disaggregating data by race and ethnicity. The COC is committed to understanding the principles of race equity and how they apply in an institutional context. We're also committed to helping our local providers engage their organizations to inform governance, decision-making, and ensuring organizational processes are designed to eliminate inequity. The COC's Race Equity Toolkit and the strategic goals of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee support holding the COC accountable at the individual and organizational levels, and to publicly advocate for race equity throughout the Pinellas County Homeless Prevention and Crisis Response System. The Race Equity Toolkit that you've heard about today is a guide and a framework for each organization to begin or further your work to eliminate inequity within your organizations, in the services provided, and in the outcomes experienced in our communities. Race equity will be achieved when no outcomes are predictable by one's race or ethnicity, and we invite each of you to work to make racial equity a reality for the Pinellas Continuum of Care. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second annual Race Equity virtual event, Making a Difference with Action. We look forward to having you again with us next year, and we wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and everybody.
care,
We did wrap up early today for you, so I hope that you appreciate the time back. I know our panelists do. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank each and every one of you for attending. I want to thank our panelists for contributing their time and energy. The Race Equity Toolkit, another copy, was placed in the chat for everyone, so feel free to download it. Watch the provider's newsletter. That's where we'll announce the quarterly technical assistance by Diversity, Equity, and Committee for the toolkit. And with that, thank you so much. I will stay online in case anybody has any individual questions.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
No,
Take care, y'all.
I'm trying to get the.
Bye, everyone. Nice seeing you all.
Thank you. Oh, no questions. It's just